Okay, I think recording is active. So this is the first of these events. We hope to have some more, but our first sort of speaker for the brown bag is going to be Hunter Fuller from the University of Alabama in Huntsville. And Hunter is on the line, and hopefully his audio is still working. So we're going to try to good. So we're going to try to progress like this. I'm going to hand it over to Hunter, and he's going to give a brief presentation. He doesn't have a full hour of material, and that's fine. So what we'll do is everybody is going to be muted, but if you have a question, just use the chat feature to sort of signal me, and I can unmute you if you have a question during as Hunter's talking, and I'll sort of signal to him that there's a question coming in, or we can, bank them up and sort of do it at the end. So thanks again for everybody for joining, and I think I'll just turn it over to Hunter and he can get going.
Thanks. I'm Hunter Fuller from UAH. This was supposed to have a less snarky title, but this is what I have. It's appeasing the security team, WAN visibility at 10 gig a second. The other CI engineer from UAH, Mike Turner, is not on the call currently, but that's who I'm working with on this. And then Brian Swan is from our systems team, wrote some of the software that I'll talk about. So at UAH, our science DMZ initiatives and stuff like that are all under the central IT, which is what I work for. That means basically that the security team expects the same sort of visibility from stuff that goes through the DMZ as stuff that goes through our general firewall, which is the Juniper. We get a lot of application analysis, stuff like that from the Junipers. So a challenge is, how do we provide that visibility for traffic that we want to route around them, which is kind of the point of the DMZ. So what we had before coming into, really even before coming into 10 gig, is McAfee Nitro. It's pretty cool in general, but some pitfalls is what I'm focusing on here. The big one being a total intake of 1 gig a second of traffic from the network. And that's stuff that you can analyze. If you ever go over 1 gig of aggregate traffic, it starts to balk at you. It will not analyze any more than that traffic. We had this working. It would store the analyses, but it wouldn't do packet capture. We actually had some of our people logging into the servers, running TCP dump to do capture and analysis of problematic traffic for security purposes. It was a little clunky for our uses. So that's kind of where we came into this. It does include headers, which I will talk about capturing headers later, but generally speaking, the 1 gig was it was proving to be a big problem for us if we want to do DMZ analysis. So ideally, we want it to be out of band, just like Nitro is, but we want some solution that can accept the full WAN fire hose. So it doesn't really matter what we do with this. First of all, we need to be able to accept it at all, and then we can talk about pruning it or analyzing certain pieces of it. Maybe we want some visibility inside the network as well. Pick buildings with more sensitive research. Here at UAH, we have some data that's protected under ITAR, for instance, a lot of space-related stuff up here in Huntsville. So we definitely need to do that analysis at multiple points. The kind of capabilities we need are intrusion detection. We'd like to store data on any flow that passes through. And if the security team needs to analyze certain flows, then I'd like to be able to provide an easy interface to start capturing data that they need to capture. This doesn't need to be historical. It just needs to be a capability that's there. So kind of the quick rundown of this. This is one of my first, this is the first thing I think I saw SDN really being used for, was Dumno on top of Bro, which is, Dumno is an NCSA tool. I'm not sure. So here's something I'm curious about. I saw quite a few talks on this at one point, and if you go ahead and drop in the chat if you've ever used Dumno. Basically, the scenario is you take a span off of the network, and you run it through a switch, and the switch will do either tap aggregation or just filtering. You want your Bro intrusion detection system to always receive certain types of packets, like opening and closing of TCP connections. But when you've determined a flow is not harmful, you don't want to keep analyzing it forever. So you shunt what's called elephant flows, which would be, if someone is watching Netflix or something, then I don't want to run analysis on that and eat up CPU on the analysis boxes. So rather than trying to drop this before it gets to the actual software on the box, we can drop it before it even enters the interface on the box. In all the talks I had seen previously on this subject, I had seen people using Arista switches for tap aggregation. And on an Arista, you can do ACLs applied to the ports that you want to tap ag on. I recently discovered that on a Catalyst 3850 from Cisco, you can apply ACLs to your monitor sessions. So if you do a span session on one port and to another port, you can actually filter that traffic using an ACL. So what we have in the lab, I should have put this disclaimer here. We don't have any of this in production yet, but it is working in the lab, and I'll have a small demo in a few minutes. So anyway, the 3850 can be controlled via Dumno now using a module that I wrote for it. So that means the general progression of this is Bro decides that it doesn't want to look at a certain flow anymore. It lets Dumno know that it should be blocking that flow. Dumno installs the ACL on the switch, and that means that our IDS doesn't need to see that flow any longer. But it does still see the TCP fine packet, meaning that when it's done, it'll know that the flow is over and it can remove that ACL. This is, so on a 3850, at least the ones that we have, that provides 10 gig. You can cut down a 10 gig connection because that's the interfaces that are present on the box. We've moved more in the direction of Brocade hardware, and I think that it should be able to do the same thing. So that might be my next investigation, because even our access layer Brocades purchased last year have 40 gig interfaces. So when we start exceeding 10 gig at our WAN edge, we'll need to, well, on a regular basis, we'll need to span at 40 gig and then do the same type of thing. And we may even be able to cut that down to 10 gig for analysis using these elephant flow shunts. I kind of went through that pretty quick. So does that make sense to everybody? I'll have a demo later on how some of the ACL installation works. But if anybody has any questions, you can go ahead with it. I don't have a problem with that. One of the other things I mentioned for security purposes was to log data on all flows. It's not to say log all of the internal data, but it's nice to know where our traffic's going. So mostly just headers, IP headers. So the way that we're doing this today is a tool that one of our systems team guys wrote called TCP-dumpd. And what TCP-dumpd does is it takes in anything on a 10 gig port, and we've done this at roughly half of line rate right now. I don't think we've done fully line rate on one of our boxes yet, but we take in the fire hose from the WAN router span that we've done. We throw away everything except headers, then we save that to disk. So we can save this basically, I wouldn't say indefinitely, but for a few days. It doesn't take a lot of disk. It takes a few tera of disk to save just IP headers of all of the traffic that we have that ranges from, let's say, 2 to 4 gigs on average for most of our campus. Of course, research flows burst that higher. So while it's summer and we don't have as much of that moving around as we normally would, we will see how we cope with that when the semester picks back up. So does the security team want us to use DLP, which I assume would be data loss prevention? We do want. I think that's on the horizon, and I know that Bro has some people have written Bro modules that will do that. And that the only worry I have with that is that we will exceed the capability of our boxes. So a lot of the value in cutting down flows before they reach Bro is to save CPU on the box. So if we're having to analyze everything, we're going to have to kind of re-architect the way that we're doing Bro, and we're going to have to enlarge the cluster. That being said, if it would be possible to alter the rules that cause ACLs to be installed to say, well, we've determined that this isn't something to worry about, so let's go ahead and shunt it. And that Netflix is a great example of that. Things that are a little less cut and dry would be like giant SSH connections. Of course, it's kind of hard to tell what's going on there. We probably want to keep the analysis active. It's not really a lot we can do in those type of scenarios, but it would limit the usefulness. But if we're spanning the traffic leaving our entire campus, even if we just span internet too, that would include Google, which would include YouTube, given our kind of transit rail type peerings. So we still want to be able to shunt those flows, and it would still be useful in that scenario. But right now we don't have anything active DLP wise. But that was a question from Jeff. Thanks. I'll actually have to ask about that because we really should be planning for that if we need to be doing it. But I do think it will still be useful for the applications we're using.
So I have one question for you as well, Hunter.
Sure.
Since you're on this slide, the in-house daemon TCP dumpd, did you make your own because existing solutions just didn't quite get what you needed, or was there another reason?
We browsed around a little bit. This thing is really it's pretty bare, and the other thing that it does that we were initially doing, actually the next slide is kind of addressing a little bit of this, but we wanted to archive very quickly, and also we index now. And so these are capabilities we built into our TCP dumpd. And as far as I know, there's not a lot of people doing indexing. If I'm wrong, I'd love to use a solution that already exists, but we weren't able to find anything that would do the indexing like this, where it throws away all the it basically throws the data away before it even saves to disk in this particular application. I wasn't able to find anything that was robust and did that. It would all want to save it to disk first for whatever reason.
Okay, makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah, of course. But on that subject, that's actually a great lead in to the next thing, which is capturing data of interest. To capture data of interest, what we had been doing is running TCP dumpd from the last slide, and then inside of TCP dump we had TCP dump rules to only capture stuff that we wanted. And actually that's what's still in production. But the problem is that the more traffic we have, the more CPU load is generated just to throw data in the garbage. Even running TCP dump on an interface with that much data coming into it, it seems that you do take a little hit. I don't know if it's DMA or what. I'm not really a hardware guy, but you start to see a lot of interrupts tying up the system. We're kind of reaching the capacity on that. So the other way to capture data of interest that we've kind of devised, as far as I know, I don't think this is, as far as I know, I haven't seen this considered before. But if you just use Dumno, and if you recall, Dumno takes what you would normally plug into an IDS and it lets you cut it down. It lets you cut down stuff that you don't care about. But if you take Dumno and you patch it to operate in reverse, you basically by default capture nothing, and then you let anyone who's doing troubleshooting or doing security analysis ask Dumno to add ACLs that permit certain traffic to be captured. If you do this, then you have an interface that you can let people add ACLs, add specific ports or specific hosts or whatever that they want to do analysis on, install those rules onto the switch that is in front of the span, and then the switch will do all the work to filter. So you've just like in the bro scenario, you've plugged your span into your switch, and the switch is doing the filtering, but you just use it in a positive direction. And then just like in the previous slide, we take TCP dumpd to take that traffic coming inbound, and this time we gzip it because the traffic can be kind of large. We save it to disk, and then whatever it is that the security team does, they do. I don't do a lot of this, but I've used this feature for troubleshooting already. I know that when WannaCry was a big deal, we used kind of a beta version of this to capture any packets that were destined for their control servers, which was a little difficult because it was apparently a huge list, but we did at least have a good indication of what systems on campus were infected. And so that's the type of thing that we can do, is add ACLs that would reflect those types of data, capture it, and then analyze it after the fact. And this is all done in the filtering is all done in hardware on the switch, just like when we were doing it for the IDS purposes. So this is perfect, and I have no possible future things to actually. The first problem that I immediately came up with is that we are going to run into 10 gig eventually. We're already halfway there, and that's just only in the past year and a half have we seen an uptick that is actually justifying our installation of 10 gig. which is kind of surprising, but it's what we've seen. But if we have total flows totaling over 10 gig, then we're going to start throwing stuff on the floor even before we can get it to the hardware switch to prune it. So the first thing we're going to need to do is look into what hardware can do this at 40 gig. We might end up with Aristas. I would really prefer if some stuff we already own could do this, but that's to be seen. A thing that we already have almost ready is indexing the basic flow data into SQL. We use Postgres heavily here, and that data is really not huge. And so if you put it into a SQL database, now you can do queries and say, well, did this host talk over here at this time when it was supposed to? Did it talk over here when it wasn't supposed to? And we have a problem with, now we have a compromised machine or whatever the case may be. And that is currently in testing. I wish I could show that to you today. Dumno by default right now, and I think this is all it can do, automatically removes the elephant flows based on 2 minutes having elapsed, if I remember right. But I'd like to read the hit count off of the switch and remove flows that aren't being incremented anymore. And this would make it much more applicable to, for instance, UDP flows that don't really have a close. So I want to close the session, so to speak, when UDP traffic stops flowing. That's still to be developed. One interesting thing is if we're doing a lot of archiving, I found this product that accelerates gzip in hardware. So if we want to reduce CPU load further, that's a several $100 investment rather than buying a giant server to do the archiving. And then finally, this is, I don't know why this is the end, but actually the first thing I'm going to do after this is likely develop a web interface for our security team to drop ACLs in to be installed, and then they can retrieve the capture data later. So that's the possible enhancements, and I do want to give a quick demonstration of what I'm talking about. I have that open in a shell somewhere. Okay, here we go. So I have a capture running, and you can't tell because there's no data coming through. So it's just an empty screen, but this is TCP dump running in the foreground. And then here's the access list that we start with on the switch that does the capture filtering. We're going to capture any TCP traffic, but just the opens and closes from TCP. And then everything else we're not going to capture at all. But I'll show you how it works when we decide we have a box of interest that we want to look at. I have a tab over here with the Dumno client open. And this is the thing I plan to put a web interface in front of. But right now it's all Python. So I'm just going to kind of tickle the method myself real quick. So if I want to grab from our DNS server, I'm just going to say that I want to see all the DNS queries that are run. So I've added that ACL. And now I'm just going to grab iperf. I don't know why you would do this, because iperf is a great example of a thing you don't want to analyze. But let's just say we want to analyze iperf for some reason. I'm going to grab our iperf server. And so if we look over here on the switch, we'll see that there's 2 ACLs now installed. And those are the ACLs that apply to the monitor session. So now I'm going to generate some DNS traffic. And here's TCP dump capturing the DNS traffic. But if I make outgoing DNS traffic, actually this will be filtered. But if I do it to a different server, I'm not going to see it because I did it based on the IP address of the server. But I'm going to go ahead and add one more rule. Actually, I'll do destination. Or no, I'll do source. I'll capture everything from that box. That should give us something interesting. Okay, so any traffic sourced from my testing box in the lab will capture now. So we can see it doing NTP sync already. Now I'll do another dig. Oh, apparently I'm not going to see that if it doesn't leave, but I can do an iperf. Yeah, so there's all the iperf data coming through. And this is all due to every time I add a rule through Dumno, it is actually doing the opposite of what it was designed to do, and it's permitting that traffic to come through the monitor session. So that's basically what we have, and this is on Cisco hardware, which as far as I know is a new thing. So we'll be open sourcing this, and we'll be either open sourcing TCP dumpd or patching something else that exists if it does exist and is able to be modified in that way. But we do plan on releasing all of this, so hopefully it becomes useful to someone as well as us. But that's how we are doing packet analysis right now. Well, thank you, Eli. I am curious if anybody has any questions or thoughts or suggestions or anything like that. Just drop it in the chat or whatever works.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Hunter. So while people sort of think if they have any questions, I have a couple that I wrote down really quick.
Okay.
So right now, you said that you're hitting CPU limitations as you get closer to 10 gig of traffic to sort of analyze. What are the specs on the host system right now, if you don't mind saying?
Geez, I can have that for you in a couple of minutes. I don't want to be inaccurate about the thing that I tell you, but honestly, most of the problems that we're running into are due to filtering in TCP dump. If you don't filter, it's a lot cheap. Like, it's almost cheaper to not look at the traffic at all. But every filter that we've applied cost, which is why we wanted to do it in hardware. I'll get the specs though, and I'll let you know.
Okay. All right. So John Paul Robinson has a question. So I'll just repeat it. Is this for the whole campus ingress or just the science DMZ? And you had said that this is just experimentation right now, but what do you believe it's going to be for eventually?
I think that we plan on doing the bro analysis on just the science DMZ, but the packet capture stuff we are currently applying to all of campus. Now, we're just like 8,000 students, so it's not so bad for us to do this. If we were a much larger place, I don't think it would be practical. We have enough trouble as is writing to disk fast enough on that box, but they're all spinners. So if it was solid state, I think that would be a little easier. But yeah, some of the stuff, especially the packet analysis rather than the bro, does apply to all of campus for us.
Okay. And George has also asked a question. So actually, I think at this point, what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to unmute people as they come in so I don't have to keep reading them because I'm getting lazy. So George, I'm going to unmute you and then you can ask your question, okay? So let's see if we can do that. All right, can you hear us, George?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Thank you. Thank you. I enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you.
I was thinking, you said that you wanted to capture some basic flow information, and I was thinking, do you consider NetFlow, because you are using Cisco, and I think Cisco implement NetFlow.
Right, and actually Ken just asked the other question about SFlow. We are capturing this data in addition, from the brocades we do capture SFlow. So the brocades are mostly our, we do have a couple of MLXs for Science DMZ type routing. And we're capturing SFlow from those, and we're capturing NetFlow from the Cisco edge that we run. So we do capture that. However, NetFlow is always a low priority for the router. I think that we would like to move away from capturing it in band like we are right now. One thing that I'm not really sure about, but it didn't seem to be supported, I couldn't figure it out, is if we can span on one router and then capture NetFlow on another router off of that span. I haven't had a lot of luck getting that to work, because that would make this a lot easier. But as far as running NetFlow, we've actually, maybe I'm a little gun shy about running NetFlow in general. We've had a few instances on some of our routers where running NetFlow actually caused CPU issues on the router, and none of this. We can circumvent all of these problems by doing the capture off of the box. Span seems to be very little effort for it, so we're trying this out and seeing if it's a lower impact for us.
Thank you.
Ken, I don't know if that addressed what you mean or not.
Yeah, we're pretty much in our Science DMZ brocade as well, and we capture SFlow off any port from the Science DMZ down. We're also looking at, well, we do deny all by default on the ACLs coming in, and then we do some, then anything that comes through there, we do a full packet capture back to bro.
Gotcha.
But we're also trying to do some ACL filtering so that we can actually deduplicate what we're sending back to the collectors, because we already collect what's coming through the border, and then through the Science DMZ we're capturing a second time. So we're trying to do some, like you said on your 3850, some ACL filtering or something like that to cut down on some of the other stuff going through there. But
Right, and we really need to look into doing that for brocades right now. So most of our core is Cisco, and then the edges are Brocade, and so the Science DMZ stuff generally hangs out on the Brocades. We do S-flow capture from the edges all the way through the core until it gets to the Cisco where it's NetFlow, and we aggregate all that. Just otherwise, that's just operationally what we end up doing.
Okay.
For the DMZ, it would be really helpful if we could use a Brocade for that, because all the Brocade gear we have has 40 gig. So that's kind of an obvious step. The Cisco has 40 gig. I could output the span there. You know, it'd be great. So I might end up investigating that next.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Data footprint for flow capture. For full flow capture, right now what we've been doing is we've been capturing just 2 specific areas where we keep some of our servers and stuff, and this is not Science DMZ related. But even with that, we fill up, I mean, 1.5 tera or 2 tera of disk within a day. That's just 2/20s worth of traffic. It's like tearing through the disk, and we can't keep it very far back. So that's why we're looking for ways to filter. For just the headers capture, like I said, it's like a few megabytes of the same data would just be a few megabytes, and so that's why we're looking at that for the default being, you know, capture just headers and other metadata.
If I can follow up on that, kind of maybe tangentially, you were just saying that you're part of the IT organization at UAH. Do you mind clarifying a little bit more about what team you're on or what role you play, and then are you all responsible for running the Science DMZ, or is that another team?
Right. I've come to learn this is pretty unusual, but the Science DMZ is operated by Central IT here at UAH, and security is within that, and I am the cyber infrastructure engineer, and I also work under network services under Central IT. So I thought that would be a more common scenario, but I've learned that most people have their Science DMZ run as more of the research side, but right now it's all under one roof, and so we work pretty closely on stuff like this.
Thank you.
One thing I just kind of was thinking about earlier today, in organizations where there's more of a split there, if there's at least cooperation, then this API for adding ACLs for packet capture could be provided by one organization to another. So for instance, if you have a DMZ and your campus IT is really irritated that it goes around all of their firewalls and whatnot, then you can say, well, you know, if you really want to capture the data, just hit this API with the ACL you want to add, and then we'll plug this into your box and you can take whatever data you want. So if that, I actually realized that you could offer it kind of as a service in that way, but for us, it's all under one roof. Eli, I see you said that we would miss the portion of flow records as populated from routing table data. You're referring to if I tried to take a span and then, you know, run NetFlow or S-flow on that span instead of running it on the actual router?
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. That was kind of my worry, and really that seems to be almost nothing. Like that's when we get that data, it's useful, but it's not nearly as comprehensive, you know.
Yeah, I think it really depends just sort of on what you're actually, what is it that you're looking for in terms of getting NetFlow on that data feed, right? Because to first order a SYNFIN reset feed to Bro, if you then go look at the connection log, that's a proxy for flow records, you know, absent all the routing table information in flow records, right?
Right.
So I had one other question. You said at the beginning, you were talking about sort of the different sort of data classification types that you have there. And, you know, first of all, I wanted to say that I think it's really good that you're thinking about that sort of stuff up front when you're doing the design. Because I mean, that gets into some of what you can do with the Science DMZ in terms of treating it as a security architecture, right, rather than just as a performance construct. And I think that a lot of organizations would benefit if they look more at that aspect of it up front as you're doing. So I think that's excellent. And I guess I wanted to ask a little bit about that. What are how do the different stakeholders within these sort of different, data risk enclaves, how do they view these sorts of things, and what kind of input do they have to your design process, and what kind of hoops do you have to jump through to accommodate them?
So when you say that, do you mean we talk about these capture techniques and analysis techniques to people on campus, and how do they react to that? Is that basically the?
I was thinking more like it. So if you have different groups on campus, which some of whom have wide open data, and I just don't want it to be corrupted. I don't want my machines to get hacked. That's very different from a case where disclosure of data to the wrong party is a problem, right? I'm thinking of like a research hospital, or maybe some of the aerospace data that you have, or maybe if there's partnerships with industry where there's proprietary data, right? But it's still large enough that you want the performance characteristics of a science DMZ.
Right.
Certainly in the HIPAA space, there's a lot of friction right now, where people are trying to figure out how to get all that stuff done in a way that is tractable from a sort of regulatory compliance perspective. So I just wonder if you'd run into that, and what some of your thoughts were.
Gotcha. So some of I would say the big one for us is ITAR. We don't have a lot of medical stuff, so thankfully no HIPAA. But our policy, I think I've heard this policy especially to do with supercomputing centers, where it's like, if you are not sure if this data is okay to be transmitted here, we may just not be able to help you. But that being said, due to the architecture that we're using, the only time we would get into trouble with that is if there was something very specific that said you have to have a firewall and it has to do this. Well, we're going to have a problem because we don't move these flows through the firewall. But I think ITAR specifically, we haven't had a lot of problems with, because they have the option, and they take the option of encrypting the data long before we ever see it. So we provide a fast data path. And of course, if you go back to the previous question about data, tracking data, exfil, we're not really able to do that if it's being encrypted first. But at least they can still utilize the faster connection. And I do want those flows to go through the DMZ, because if they'd be moving them through our network anyway, and they're going through the firewall, we're not getting a lot of benefit of doing analysis on that traffic. Whereas we could just punch the hole through the DMZ and let them take advantage of the fast path stuff. But if they're worried about it being encrypted or that type of thing, and they're nervous about it, as of today, we don't really want to get into it, which that's an attitude I've heard with HPC a lot, is if you're worried about your data, you probably shouldn't be running that data on our cluster. I've heard that sentiment. And so that's currently where we are. But crypto has taken care of it for the most part in the space-related data, at least. So that's handy when you are in Huntsville.
Excellent. Okay, thank you.
So we had another question that came in to me from Jim Warner. So Jim, you're unmuted if you want to ask your question.
Sure, I hope you can hear me.
Yep. Yes.
Our security guys are pretty heavily invested in optical splitters to get their taps for looking at our data. And what I wanted to ask is, are you using splitters, or are you just using span ports?
I'd stay at span ports. I'm hoping to go for the splitter, because right now, a big limitation of a span port is obviously that if you span a 10 gig connection onto a 10 gig connection, you've actually kind of halved the capacity, right? Because you've got to transmit the either direction down a cable that, only in one direction. So we could split this up a little better and have it captured both sides on separate interfaces, and that would be really handy if we had an optical splitter for that. This is right now is just in the lab. I think if we put it in production and we saw that we were dropping packets, that would be probably our first angle of attack, would be to get that type of thing in there. Either that or move to a 40 gig span interface, and then we've eliminated the problem a different way.
Are your 40 gig brocades ICXs, or are they something different?
We have two MLXs as kind of the SDN related core. And then everything else on campus, we actually just replaced everything with ICXs. And we have 7450s at the access layer, and we have 7750s for distribution.
Okay, thanks.
No problem.
All right. I haven't seen any additional questions come in, so does anybody else have anything that they'd like to ask? All right. Well, I'd like to thank you again, Hunter, for giving the first presentation for this, and I think got a lot of good questions and a lot of good suggestions. I think when you're ready to maybe be ready to release this out into the public, you'll probably have a lot of willing beta testers on the CI list if once you guys are at that point.
Well, that's excellent to know. If anybody has any thoughts or runs it by other people and has suggestions or just wants to be notified when I do release it, then drop me an email.
Okay, so I'm going to stop this recording, and we'll